knowing that the subject this morning, the theme for this month is Sabbath, I thought about simply standing up here a few minutes and sitting down. And letting you all get to whatever wonderful plans you have for the day a little early. But I fear some of you might just fill the time with work instead. We've looked together at the idea of Sabbath before. Some of you might recall an uncommonly biblical sermon of mine that parsed out the differences between the first time the Ten Commandments appear in the Hebrew Scriptures and the second time they appear, having undergone some heavy revisions. You might recall that the first time the commandments appear, humans are told that they should rest on the Sabbath day because that's what God did on the seventh day. So the implication was, if it's good enough for her, it's good enough for me. But then humans did not listen a lot to that. So it appears. Because a few books later on, in Deuteronomy, the scriptures have a revision. The longest revision is of this commandment on the Sabbath. But this time, the commandment about the Sabbath told the people to remember that you were slaves in Egypt and you didn't get any rest. I'm paraphrasing. So remember that you were slaves together, and when you rest, it is doing the opposite. The beautiful, the seemingly impossible thing you can now do because of the help I gave you. Remember this. It's the only commandment that says to remember something. One of the common misconceptions about Sabbath is that it's about doing nothing. Many cultures practice a day of rest, of course, at the time of Sabbath. In many Buddhist communities, including some entire Buddhist countries, Upasaka is observed as a day for cleansing a defiled mind, leading to inner calm and joy. Scholars refer to it as something like a Sabbath. But in Buddhism, the calm and the joy isn't achieved by lolling around, by taking a little me time, the way some people think of Sabbath. In the practice of much of Buddhism, Upasaka is a time for intensifying the meditative aspects of communal life, as well as increasing the ways that members of the community care for one another. It's not that folks do less. They do more of certain things. And it isn't only from the sacred traditions that the Sabbath takes its place. One of my favorite lines ever uttered on television was by Maggie Smith on Downton Abbey, the PBS series that spans essentially the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England. The character of the wealthy family's driver was asked to attend to something having to do with one of the cars. And in the presence of this family matriarch, played by Maggie Smith, he said, "I'll tend to that over the weekend." And Maggie Smith said, "What on earth is a weekend?" See, it wasn't until the boom of industry at the start of the 20th century that the idea of a weekend even came into being. In fact, some of the labor practices at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution looked suspiciously like the very kind of work the early followers of the Hebrew Scriptures were forced to do. We are supposed to remember that they didn't have to do that anymore. And it was in the cotton factories of New England and the beginning of the 20th century in Henry Ford's factories where a new practice emerged, a 5-day work week. Those overseeing the labor forces were actually responding specifically, likely under some pressure, to the needs of the members of the Jewish workforce at that time. So to have the Sabbath off from working. So if you're someone who enjoys your weekends and the 5-day work week, you really have the Jewish members of your local union to thank for it. And by roughly 1940, the 5-day work week became mostly standard in the United States and in Europe. But there wasn't a great deal else in the United States or Europe in 1940 that was standard about that time. The rise of fascism in elected governments across Europe had led to full-scale attempts by Germany and its ruling Nazi Party to conquer Europe and eventually try to conquer the world. And as many in these lands are all too familiar, not long after an alignment between Germany and Japan, the Japanese military forces attacked the United States military forces at the port of Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into what many thought would be the end of all wars. Many wonder if that is what President Truman perhaps thought when he ordered the first of 2 nuclear strikes on Japan on August 6, 1945 in Hiroshima, and then the second on August 9, 1945 in Nagasaki, both of which we will remember next week. Even to name that these things occurred, the bombing of innocent lives in this way, the literally earth-shattering impact of these weapons, and the reading Martina offered us today brings to mind what a nightmare means. Brings to mind what the great gaping silence of so many lost lives doesn't sound like. Brings to mind what it could feel like to be in some kind of hell. And how true the words of General Sherman, who gave the order to burn an entire city to the ground during the Civil War, war is hell. And mostly here in this place, in our shared tradition, we don't hold to any shared understanding that there is some kind of supernatural hell that awaits people. But here in these lands, there were whispers. Whispers of a place buried in the memories of our neighbors, who could name a hell if they saw it again. It's a landscape born of fear and built on infamy, where the whispers of a place not far from where we sit comfortably, resting here on this Sabbath day, took place. And there was a day when those whispers turned into talk. It was in 1998, when in advance of the release of Schindler's List, a master work of Steven Spielberg about the horrors of the Holocaust, a call came into the Japanese Cultural Center from a local television station. The station was hoping for a local angle on the story of the movie and asked about the history of internment camps on the island of Oahu. For those of you who don't know, following the attack by the Japanese military in these lands, Oahu had a population of roughly 40% who identified as part of Japanese ancestry. And the enactment of martial law and a presidential executive order set in motion the detention of 120,000 individuals of Japanese descent around the country, including on this island, in many cases with no real cause. There were internment camps set up actually on every island. There were actually a dozen or so throughout these islands. But none of them were like the largest one. And it was on this island. A hidden, dry gulch, devoid of any identifying features, prized for its secrecy and disorienting isolation, was chosen for the site. It was called Honouliuli, but those interned in that site gave it the name Jigoku Dani, or Hell Valley. We had a presentation, an amazing one here, led by our Dialogue on Race and Ethnicity, or ADORE group, about this very occurrence. But most of what people knew of the place at the time, what they would say of the place, was only whispers then. I met with Betsy Young this week. She is one of the people who first heard of this request from the television station, who works at the Japanese Cultural Center. She explained that there was a problem with responding to the station's request. No one at the center knew exactly where this camp was. They had a general idea of the vicinity, but not the exact spot. Though there was some knowledge about what life was like in Hell Valley, the exact location was elusive. Even those researching the history could not find it. But Betsy knew that the Department of Defense probably had records, but they were not sharing them. The people with the information didn't want to share it. They didn't want to talk about this painful period in the history of these lands. And those interned, many of them, did not want to talk about this either. And any visitors to the site when it was opened in the 1940s were blindfolded in town before boarding a bus to visit, and then blindfolded again and returned to town. Many wanted that period, that place, to be laid to rest, and others simply had no idea where it was. And then one of Betsy's colleagues at the Japanese Cultural Center noticed something. There were only 5 photographs available to the public of this camp. And she saw something in the background. It was an aqueduct, just tucked behind in the background along a hill. So Betsy and her colleagues went to the map rooms at University of Hawaii. Then they went to the map rooms down in Honolulu City Hall. They scoured the water maps of the Board of Water Supply until they finally found a map of the location at that time of the camp. And they saw who owned the land. It was owned at the time by the Campbell estate. Those of you who've been here a little while, you might recall that the Campbell estate represented the land holdings of the sugar-producing industrialist James Campbell, who later reaped great wealth for himself and his descendants from those land holdings. So at the time when the volunteers from the Japanese Cultural Center discovered that the site of Honolulu was on the lands included in the Campbell estate, they weren't sure they'd ever get a chance to find it. Also, some of you have lived here for quite some time. Think about how much vegetation you think might grow on a site untouched for 50 plus years. Now, after some convincing, representatives from the Campbell estate said they would allow 5 people onto the land to see what they could find. It was 2002 now. The first call about this possible site came into the Japanese Cultural Center in 1998. It had taken 4 years of research and focused attention to get to this point. And so the 5 people were selected to go on the exhibition, and all they were armed with was this map they had found, the 5 photographs from a book published in 1949, and personal narratives of internment published in 1982 that described the place they were looking for 70 years ago. And the 5 most knowledgeable people entered the site and started the search. There were no paths, there were no walkways, but Betsy and her friends kept on. Hours into the search, these experts, for the life of them, could not find the site and match it to the aqueduct in the pictures from the book, and they wondered if they were in the wrong spot. They looked at the photo, they looked at the land, then back at the map, and they were thinking about giving up, and that's when someone noticed something. It wasn't a building, that they had missed. It wasn't a concrete slab over somewhere. The map was upside down. And only after this exploring party turned the map the correct way could they see what they were looking for. Then 3 hours into the search, this party of 5, focused and determined in a way that they never had before, discovered and began that day the hard work that has happened ever since of uncovering the best preserved location of an internment camp used by U.S. forces to imprison citizens and prisoners of war during the Second World War. This was in 2002, and some of you may know that the Campbell estate, though, eventually liquidated some of its assets, selling them to the highest bidder. And the purchaser of the land where the camp was located was a little company you might recognize. They had a bit of a reputation in the agricultural field, a little outfit called Monsanto. And anyone who knows about Monsanto, I just heard the groans, might imagine that all of the work finding this camp might have been in vain. But somehow, someone in the Campbell estate thought ahead and attached a requirement, a codicil, to the sale of the land that would allow access to the land for archaeological reasons. So the excavation of the site began. And after years and years of work, it was clear that this site needed to be maintained. So in 2014, Monsanto actually donated the land to the federal government to ensure its preservation. And so it came to pass that on February 24, 2015, a child who knew this very congregation, this church, educated upstairs from where we are sitting, issued his executive order with the commandment that Honouliuli would be a national monument. But in talking with Betsy at the center, it wasn't that announcement that she seemed to care much about. Because she said that really, the amount of money needed at this point to do the work to turn the site into the monument she feels it should be, to really get across to visitors what took place, what a gulch of the unthinkable might feel like, what Hell Valley really was to those people, is frankly more money than she is sure the project will ever receive. Instead, at the end of our conversation, she spoke about the ways that so many different people, companies you would never expect, came together to make this happen, including one of the fiercest companies I've ever known. And what Betsy left me with before moving through the office to deliver really, really beautiful hibiscus flowers she had with her, maybe some of the most beautiful I've ever seen, was her rote memorization of a different declaration. It was the public statement that the internments and mass incarcerations that were allowed to happen at Honouliuli were, and I quote as she did, fundamental violations of the basic civil liberties and constitutional rights, and were motivated largely by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. This was part of the Civil Liberties Act signed by President Ronald Reagan in 1988 and preceded presidential apologies that Japanese American survivors of this ordeal received directly from the president on behalf of the nation that failed them. A president who apologizes. Imagine that. I told Betsy that I would be talking about this story in the sermon. And she did offer something that she'd really like people to know. It's that the kind of reparation and restitution that is taking place now for her, with partnering, development, discovery, and protection of something so important, doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen on a whim. It takes years of study and planning. It's taken years of building up relationships. And it is far like anything worth doing from over. I have to say that I was struck by how excited and happy she was to be talking about Hell Valley and the hellish horrors of that war. But war is hell for what it lacks, as much for what it holds. It lacks love, compassion, understanding, restraint, and war is hell because it is waged by people against people. And when a person can give a commandment from on high that sends 2 cities up in a fire blazing like hell itself, when racial prejudice inflames wartime hysteria in people so that hate flashes out at others, when people forget that someone, somewhere, in every single one of our ancestors' lives couldn't stop, couldn't take time to rest, couldn't think about a day off or a weekend. These are when it's more important to remember, to heed the warning of wisdom, and remember together to search, maybe together, for the valley of the shadow of death right in our own backyard with compassion. To remember together what happened in places that took so much from so many, including their very mortal lives, in hopes of long hoped for justice. To remember together that the valley of death does not get the last word in our lives, the last commandment over us. Instead, that together, working patiently, persistently, but with real dedication, maybe the only need we have is to look right down the street at the Japanese Cultural Center or right up the H1 at Hell Valley. We may only need look in Betsy's eyes or other people who do this work, who help to turn an upside-down world right side up. We might only need to close our eyes, hold tight to our neighbor's hand, and remember together to know that it might only be by unearthing what we think is a hell that we can finally know joy at last. May it ever be so. Blessed be and amen.